And good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to this session on creating decolonized African archives. My name is Elizabeth Ifwa Sutherland. I'm joining you from Ghana, and I'll be moderating. We have a really cool panel today, and I'm just gonna jump off with our first question, and we'll get straight into it. So panelists, feel free to jump in anytime you want. The first question I have for you is, what is the power of an archive? And if you can use that as a question a provocation to link to your work, how do archives and archival practice factor into your personal current works and projects? Anyone want to go, or do I have to pick on people?
I think Karen should go.
Oh, all right, Karen, there we go.
Thanks, Malemo. How kind of you. All right, no, but it's standard because I'm actually, I am an archivist, physical and digital archivist, so it's fair enough. What is the power of an archive? I think the power of an archive comes from the ability it has to organize things that are in front of you within a frame. And then you're able to look at things a lot more closely, to see gaps, to see links. And you don't necessarily get that if things are scattered outside of that frame. And I'll take, for instance, the work that I'm now doing with the Center for Creative Arts around the Poetry Africa Festival. It's been running for 25 years, 26 this year. And what we're currently doing now is documenting the whole full role of poets who have participated, as well as the funders who have participated in sponsoring the festival. And what that's going to allow us to do is kind of get a purview of, okay, so we've been able to engage with poets from these parts of the world, and we've been able to engage with funders from these parts of the world, but who haven't we tapped into? Where are our gaps? And then start asking deeper questions around why. Why have we not gone into Chile? Why have we gone into Ghana a lot? Why have we not gone into Niger? Why have we not gone more into Botswana? So to start picking up questions that you can then start answering through how you curate your festival. So strategic planning, as well as understanding your own kind of identity. So I think, yeah, the power of archive is definitely, for me, organizing and then interrogating and seeing things better.
Thank you, Karen. Who'd like to go next? Malimo?
Yeah.
Did I say that right?
Yeah, I feel like it's my responsibility, considering I put Karen on the spot. But
that's right.
Deferring to her expertise as the archivist in the group, I think very much agree that the archive is a very useful tool for interrogation and for asking kind of questions that we might not immediately identify without kind of fully unpacking and engaging with that. So with the work that I do as part of Open Restitution Africa with my really amazing colleague, Chao Tayana, based in Nairobi. I'm based in Johannesburg, she's based there. Together, we kind of engage with the archive at a number of levels, in the sense of kind of looking at trying to make the archive around restitution more transparent. So understanding the history of restitution, who has asked for what, when, and what's come back and what hasn't. Which is actually really difficult information to find, and which, as Karen has said, once you kind of dig into that, you're able to ask much more targeted questions and understand the issues much more clearly, but also potentially find the answers you're looking for. We also look quite a lot at the digital space, which is really the expertise of Chao, my colleague, who runs African Digital Heritage. And look at this kind of space of restitution and the digital as well. And so one of the other archives we are really interested in is the online archive, which is often a slightly more contemporary, more recent archive, but which mimics a lot of the political problematics of the kind of more historical archive as well. So looking at questions of things like who gets published, whose voices get heard, who is interviewed when it comes to restitution issues. And thinking about the kind of archive that starts to exist on the online space, also in the digitization of museum collections, and all the politics and problematics that come with that, and the kind of replication of the real life archive online as well.
Thanks. Why don't we have Amy?
Thanks, Elizabeth. Hi, everyone. It's really cool to be a part of this panel. And it's so interesting to hear what all of you are doing and how there's crossovers with our work. I am a theatre maker, a writer, and a digital artist. And I'm part of an artistic duo called the Low Def Film Factory. We work with new media, like virtual reality, like photogrammetry. So a lot of our stuff is like, I guess we're engaging with the archive in different ways, but for us, really dealing with the archive is about working with the archive as kind of a foundation for the production of like future knowledge. So like working with the idea of the speculative archive. And so we do kind of these like long-term creative research projects. I guess I'll talk more about what specifics in later, but we do these long-term creative research projects where we work with like archival materials, but then we work with performance, we work with film, we work with young people, we do workshops, and it's around like filling in some of these archival gaps and some of these archival silences. And then also like Rolemo, working a lot in the online space with like digitization and 3D assets and what kind of stuff is existing in the online archive from an African perspective, and seeing how we can be really creative and like radical with it and messing with it a lot. Yeah.
Thank you. And Nashilongwe Shipwe, did I get there? Awesome. So let's hear from you, gentlemen.
Yes.
Our gentleman on the pack. Yeah.
Good afternoon, good morning, good day. Hello, everyone. Greetings from Windhoek. Nashilongwe Shipwe Mushanja. I'm a cultural worker in Namibia. Also scholar and writer. With what I like to say is an unhealthy obsession with the archive. That's me. I have an unhealthy obsession, unhealthy relationship with the archive. But maybe before we get to the unhealthy part, is maybe to think of the archive as always as a way of doing epistemology. Archival work is epistemic work because it's knowledge production first and foremost. It's about preserving archives, but it's almost very much about the future as it is about the past, right? So archive has everything to do with the future. So how I come to archives is being an artist, a musician, a theater maker, a performance artist, and thinking about ways in which different ways of archiving. So I work with institutions in sort of with archival institutions such as the African Library of African Music, the Basler Africa Bibliographie, and yes, just thinking about using some of these old songs that have been recorded that we remember from home that we might not know, and trying to create newer works, trying to find inspiration from these archives. But to also think beyond the institutional archives and to think about the body as an archive, because as a performance person, that's where we come from. It's thinking about the knowledge that the body holds, its memories, and the archival potential of that stuff. But allowing that archive of the body and the archive in the institution and the archive of place to be in conversation with each other, and to produce some kind of method that allows for friction between these different archives. So without privileging one, but rather allowing the different ways of producing archive to to be in conversation with each other and to work from those tensions. And to use, yeah. Okay, I'll stop.
Great, thank you. So yeah, I'm just gonna keep asking these questions, and again, feel free to jump on to kind of establish an idea of what infrastructures exist for your work that you operate within or that you aspire to. So is there a model for archives or archiving that you think would make any sort of infrastructural difference to your current process?
I guess I can talk about that a little bit. So the kind of work that we do has a lot to do with working with existing online infrastructures and seeing how we can intervene and manipulate them. Because as we all know, a lot of these like digital infrastructures are designed in a very particular way to exclude many people and to extract data from people. So I guess like we are working with existing infrastructures. And so like just to be specific about a couple of them, the one is an archive called Sketchfab, which is like an online archive of 3D assets. So you probably know about it, Elizabeth. A lot of a lot of museums, obviously there's this huge conversation about digitizing museum archives, and many museums are busy uploading a lot of their like 3D scanning, making 3D models of a lot of their existing museum collection. And some of them are very private and you can't access the open source code, but some of them end up on somewhere like Sketchfab, where it's often free to download these 3D assets. You need to like credit the makers. But so that's the kind of infrastructure that we make use of in our work. And we kind of look at that conversation of like physical artifacts that were, originally stolen from Africa and are now like in a way being reintroduced back into like open source, and seeing how they can come back to us. I guess I'll stop there for now.
Great. And just to clarify, those are like collections of 3D artifacts that have been scanned using photogrammetry or whatever technique and uploaded to the internet. So these are collections in the States, in the West, various institutions in the West that are now available as 3D objects. Does anyone else want to weigh in on what kind of infrastructures or tools that they're using at the moment to enable their archival practice?
I can come in here, maybe also connected a bit to some of what Amy's doing. I think we're finding that we're needing to have to recreate a lot of our infrastructures, and I'm sure many of you would find you're doing the same, that the infrastructures often don't align with some of the kind of nuances and complexities that we're looking for. So some of the things, for example, that we've had to kind of build and have to work with other Africans across the continent who are actually concerned with similar kinds of work, has been things like building systems that recognize African names that can be integrated into AI systems so that we can find Africans on the internet, because the algorithms don't see us mostly, and so to be seen we have to kind of build our own infrastructures. Other kinds of things are, and I'm sure Karen would have some expertise in this, sort of needing to kind of rethink metadata frameworks. So in the museum space, for example, usually metadata frameworks would be based on the object specifically and then kind of build out from that in a kind of quite, as Nashi was saying, kind of the epistemic logic of those who built those frameworks. And so a lot of the things that are important within our context, such as like originary populations who created these objects, or like I say, the spiritual importance of these objects, there's no space for those kinds of things in the infrastructures we're inheriting. So we're needing to kind of hack the frameworks that are available to us to better meet the needs of the kinds of archives we're needing to build and the kinds of, I suppose, politically important information that's important to kind of bring forward in the archives that we want to create and want to have available for other people to use.
I think that's actually so interesting, both from Amy and Molemo's points of view in terms of what's going on in the digital space. And I think, okay, so for my training happened from a physical archive being digitized into digital archives. It was my first gig, my first job was at the Lily's Leaf archive. It's a struggle history archive, and so they have all this like manuscripts and documents and all these secret letters and whatnot, trying to get it online. And the big speech that we got at the beginning of the training was, this is about accessibility. And I think the more projects I've gotten onto, what I find is lacking is a consistency in the narrative around what we're actually doing when we're taking stuff from the physical space to the digital space. And so for me, I'm still searching for, I don't know, it's never going to be uniformity, but like a level of understanding or a spectrum for why it is that we digitize things, why we take them from the physical to the digital. I think those conversations need to be had. What are we doing? Are we recreating what's happening in the archive? Because that's very problematic, because we already know the archive is, even if it's a contemporary one, it's still very problematic. All the power dynamics that come into them. So what are we actually doing when we're taking something from the physical to the digital? And how do we, what challenges are we trying to overcome? And I think National Ngishipo will speak a little bit more on it from the perspective of the 500-year archive, but I think they're tackling some of those kind of more complicated questions. But we need that, an infrastructure for what it is that we're actually doing when we're translating from one to the next. Yeah.
If I can chip in, I mean, I'm very invested in the questions of the digital, as I'm suspicious about the digital, but I want to point to another form of infrastructure that Molemo always reminds us about, and this is the infrastructure of people as infrastructure in museums, around archives, people as archives. And maybe these are not new emerging infrastructures, maybe in some context like the university, where the sustained reading and writing has always been the most legitimate form of knowledge. And now there are things like oral history and all these things. But thinking about people, and really also in a way what Molemo in this very interesting chapter, which I've forgotten the title, but I'll tell you about what it's about, is kind of trying to shift from the object to the human, trying to establish processes that are humanizing, because archives, museums are fundamentally built on processes of dehumanizing other people, right? So think in Molemo's terms, using this nto, which refers to a thing, which is what often in archives and museums and restitution debates is the main thing, right? We're interested in the nto, the thing, and moving to ntu, the human, and acknowledging that knowledge, which I referred to in the beginning as embodied knowledge, as situated knowledges, oral history, whatever you want to call it, and that it's not necessarily new, and that it's to some extent gives us a lot more principles to work with. Around accessibility, for example, it's a lot more possible for me to approach an elder in my neighborhood or my village than get an archival object, an object out of a national archive, for example. So it's allowing to think, and not to necessarily romanticize Ubuntu, the humanizing process, whatever that means, which is also caught up in all kinds of things, but to open ourselves up to for the archive, for the university, for the museum to open itself up to that framework, because then that brings, might be generative, I think.
Yeah, thanks. That leads us actually really tidily into our I'm going to skip over one question and come back. We've been speaking about how so much of our tradition is somatically based. It's based in the body, it's oral, it's movement making, it's mark making. What is the potential in terms of interfaces now that we have access to things like video, audio recordings, so we're not really relying on written words or, you know, some of these more one-dimensional means of data capture? What are the potentials for some of these new technologies, and how do you think they're being spread in your immediate context and across the continent? Is there equitable access to technology, this type of technology, and how are people using it?
I'll jump in here with just a sort of first thoughts. I mean, I think that's what, in large part, what Karen was also pointing to with this idea that digitizing collections means that they're accessible, which of course we all know is, I probably can't swear on this platform, nonsense. And that so often the kind of move towards digitization is also, it's not just not accessible in the sense that people don't have access necessarily, like in South Africa, data is so expensive, right? Just alone that issue. And then there's hardware issues, but then there's also just the way putting something on the internet is effectively putting it there to get lost in amongst the kind of masses of everything else. And I think really when there is an agenda for access, when there's a true agenda for access, we see a lot of really fascinating projects on the continent that immediately start to move between the kind of IRL and the digitization process, and recognize, I think, some of these complexities of the archive operating in multiple spaces and in people as well, as Mushanja was saying. And I think there are a number of really amazing examples from the African continent. I'm thinking of the Zambian Women's History Museum, or some of the work that Policy does in Uganda, Nima Aye, who are moving constantly between kind of the IRL and the in-person, and working through often artistic practices to also bring some of this stuff that's now online into kind of new formations of understanding, whether it be through fashion or dance or other forms of performance practice, for example. And I think you're always going to see people who are committed to this finding ways to move across this line, rather than assuming that things that are online are somehow accessible.
Yeah, I think it's such a fine line between, just as you said, there's just such a massive proliferation of like data and images. It's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And that question of like, well, what's the point? What's the point of just like putting this onto the internet and just putting this archive out into the ether? What's the point of it? Like one critical example that I'm thinking of now, like doesn't come from the African continent, but just like apropos your question of kind of like subversive ways of working with these technologies in the archive, like reminds me of this Iranian artist, I forget her name now, Morishin Aliari. Yeah. So you probably know her project where she was like 3D printing objects that like artifacts that were destroyed by ISIS. So she kind of like she printed these objects also with like miniature objects with USBs inside of them. And on those USBs was like the code to be able to reprint the objects in the future. And then she also created this online platform where the open source code was available. So that's kind of just like one really amazing example of like super important cultural artifacts translating to the digital towards this idea of preservation for knowledge in the future in a really meaningful way, I think. And I guess just one other example I want to share. Maybe I'm just going to really quickly share my screen. Okay, anyway, I'll figure that out later. But we've been working on this project for the last couple of years called the Subterranean Imprint Archive, which looks at like nuclear histories from Central and Southern Africa. So starting with, it's like about material extraction and kind of looking at the story of technological progress from the African perspective. And so the project involved a lot of work with the archives from Central and Southern Africa. And as we know, like nuclear archives, like many archives, are pretty much disintegrated or from an incredibly like biased perspective, or they don't exist at all. And one kind of digital technological intervention that we did was working with this idea of like a particular mine in the DRC called Shinkolobwe, which was the main producer of uranium. The uranium was mined from Shinkolobwe to create the atomic bomb that was dropped on Japan. So it's like a part of this great story of technological progress that many people don't know. It's like left out of the archive of nuclear history. And so we made this Google mapping intervention where previously when you looked at Shinkolobwe on the map from like a street view, there would be nothing. There would just be like no view. You wouldn't be able to zoom in or see anything about how it looked or even the surrounds to Lubumbashi. So we did like a Google mapping intervention where now if you go on Google Maps, you go on Street View and you search Shinkolobwe, this mine, you can kind of like click around and see this whole like archival crazy collage mashup with images and photographs and like pieces of history and pieces of the present. So I guess those are like two examples that come to mind when you talk about when you ask that question, Elizabeth.
Great, thanks. Does anyone want to weigh in on that, on maybe even on how data is even captured, you know, in the more traditional archival processes, and what the potential is now for transforming or interpreting that process?
Yeah, I definitely want to jump in there. And it's also to pick up kind of the projects that Molemo has mentioned as well. I think there's really interesting stuff that's happening where people have intentional or targeted interventions on things, and a conversation is happening between the physical and the digital. I'll give the example of a collaboration that happened with Iziko Museums and a space called the Center for Curating the Archive. They had a project called Object Ecologies. And what they did, it was centered around exactly that, around the metadata that is placed on the objects. So they took these objects out of the museums, and then curatorship students were asked to kind of recreate the narratives around these objects, and then created an online archive that then represented their challenges to the thing that's in the archive. And what was set up there was a very intentional conversation that the museum could not ignore. So they had to take in the fact that their register is limited. It's not representing a lot of people's knowledge. And this is like young kids now coming up and saying, I know this from my mom, I know this from my grand. This is legitimate, this is valid, and it should be included in how you put metadata on your objects. And the museum is now having to then take that stuff to their research office and say, okay, guys, this is entered in this way. We need to rethink how this looks in our museums and how we then present them and represent them in our little displays or in our records. And I think it's such a smart way of using technology to say, we're opening it up to say, if we could have imagined this differently, this is how they would be represented. How do we then start making these things talk to each other so that 5 years down the line, somebody walks in and looks at that vendor divining board. They don't just get the perspective of some guy who picked it up in 1915. They now have a more contemporary understanding of what's going on with this object that's in front of them. So I think those kinds of target, it was so intentional. It was small, but it was intentional. And it just gives you an idea of, if you could upscale it, how these museums could then start absorbing what happens in the digital space in a more useful way. Yeah.
I can't really say much about the digital and technology because I'm not so very well clued about that. But I think what might be really interesting to think about is what I'm trying to contribute is this question around loss or presence and absence, right? I know working with historians are very interested in trying to accumulate as much evidence as possible, if I can put it that way, the historical fact, right? So we'll try to look for issues of these publications and called the Namibian Review that I work with two fellow people who do historical work. And the challenge is that there is the normative archive, the institutional archive is very obsessed with accumulating and collecting and extracting and collect, and does not want to lose any of that. But we've seen in history, we've seen in recent examples of archives getting damaged because of, for example, environmental issues, that to say that even the collecting of knowledge, the collecting of archives is not it's not going to be here forever. And my point being that the traditional archive that you refer to actually teaches us that to have somehow a relationship with loss, because the somatic archive, that traditional archive that you are referring to, is not more about hoarding and collecting data as much as possible, but rather accepts that loss is always happening, and to be able to deal with, to work with, to remain with loss, that the archive is never complete. I don't know if that makes sense, but for me, that's a very interesting thing to think about when we think about data and preservation, really thinking about the limits of preservation, and that loss is always there, and that things sometimes are fluid, particularly with the traditional archive. I don't know if that makes sense, but that was what I thought I could quickly contribute.
Yeah, that's great. Malima, you wanted to chime in?
I do. I think what Mushanja's is saying is such a vital point, particularly in relation to the theme of this talk around decolonizing archives, because of course this hoarding thing is an inherited thing, comes from another part of the world, who saw this act of hoarding in part as a kind of way to exact their power. And a few years ago, I learned that natural history museums are starting to have a conversation about not collecting anymore, because of course, natural history museums have a very close relationship with their hoarding resulting in the kind of extinction of species, right? I saw a picture of the Smithsonian Museum, some advert that they had put out, and they had all their drawers open, and it was all exotic birds of some sort, like parrots or something, but they had like 20 of exactly the same kind in one drawer, and then 20 of another kind. And they just open these drawers and they're proud of it, you know? And I was so surprised when this Brazilian museum burnt down, which was obviously horrific, and extraordinary things were lost and very precious things were lost. But I attended a talk where that museum is intending on replacing everything, which means that they're sending like entomologists out to catch bugs to put them back in the drawers. And it's just kind of like mind-blowing, no? That a Brazilian museum with so much of the kind of decolonial theory and narrative coming out of Brazil, that like the reaction to loss is to go out and catch more bugs, or to catch up more butterflies or frogs or whatever, no? Rather than to kind of reimagine, as you say, Mushanja, what a kind of non-object focused museum might be, or what forms of memorialization and archive might have existed indigenously in Brazil, and to think about what that might be beyond hoarding. Like, I mean, we all know that image of the like bugs with the pins, no? Of just like the same bug over and over and over and over. And that's resulted in total loss, like to never come back again kind of loss. And how is it that the loss of a museum doesn't kind of open up those questions, really defeats me. So I think your point is fundamental.
So let's continue on that thread. Seeing that we're so attached to these kind of outdated models, what is the alternative? What if we go beyond even the idea of the institution, the museum, or even in the digital space, the website or the app, which can turn into almost like gimmicky, if you really think about it? What are the alternatives? The alternatives for Africans? Where are other ways that we can frame ourselves and our stories and our collections?
Maybe I can jump in. Oh, go ahead, Mushanja, you start.
Okay, I'll just be quick. I don't know if I know what the alternative is, right? Even as a decolonial person, decolonial, or somebody who's invested in the decolonial questions, right? Who works in archives, who points out the problematics, who does that work of criticality and critique in an attempt to work towards some kind of decolonized radical imagination. I still struggle a lot with and I know you didn't say the right alternative, but just finding the right method. So I mentioned earlier that I'm interested in archival frictions. So thinking about archives from an African perspective, what is an archive? So as a performance person, I know that African concepts of performance, for example, are archival, they're citational. But I also work with colonial archive. For me, it's to interface. I think Elizabeth, you pointed to that question in one of your questions, that to interface, to create a conversation between these different archives, and to always understand that ethically you will always be challenged, because there are all these power questions, there are all these histories and implications, and so forth. So for me, the alternative model is, the alternative method is to allow these different epistemologies, these different archives that might not usually meet to meet.
Yeah, I think I agree very much, and I think we've already had some examples that really speak to this, in the sense that I think this point that Mushanja makes about we now have the inheritance of the archive, and we have to remain in difficulty with that. What Mushanja was raising about the ethics, that you have to kind of stay with the trouble, and then to use them in ways that challenge what the kinds of hegemonies they used to be part of, let's say. So I think Karen's original point around arts organizations using archives to really think about their own programming, to question the way they've chosen to program, to develop kind of new frameworks of thinking around their own work, is the kind of way that you can take this inheritance and then rework it. Or Amy's example of the images inserted into Google Maps as a way to take the archive and kind of plug a gap. I think this is probably the most ethical way to work with what is otherwise an unethical reality, right? That we have. Mushanja often speaks about like burning down the museum as a kind of provocation for the alternative, and I think that kind of it kind of speaks to, okay, I mean, this thing is horrible, it's problematic. What do we do with it? And I think the point of staying in the difficulty with it, and then ensuring that it begins to work for another politics, is the most ethical way to approach it.
I'm super interested, Molemo, in this question in terms of what you guys were doing with like algorithms and language and African names, because we've also been grappling with this question. The Mozilla Foundation, they fund work of like, there's something called the Creative Media Award, which we are fellows of this year, and the focus is on data, and is on like rethinking data, and like data from an indigenous perspective, and the relationship between language and data. And so like one example that one of the Australian artists gave is a there was this like Aboriginal radio station who kind of put out a call on the radio station. They were like, we want to create like a WhatsApp voice note archive of our language. And so we want you to like send in as many words as you can. We want to start like building up this archive. And like hundreds of thousands of people sent in voice notes of them saying different words. And it was like really, really comprehensive. And they built up this super amazing, just brilliant archive. And within about a month of kind of them revealing how amazing and how comprehensive this archive was, they had like multiple approaches from US companies saying, we want to buy this data. We need access to it. And so it's like, it's such a complicated question because we all understand the importance of like preservation and collection of this kind of information. And we know that we need to like preserve stories, we need to like preserve languages, we need to preserve the oral, and it's this big weight. But then it's like, what happens once we create this data? Like, what do we do with this problem of like ownership and who gets control of it?
Thanks, Amy. Does anyone want to actually weigh in on that question that you just asked about ownership and control and maybe funding as well? I'm hearing a bit of that as well, that issue when somebody, of course, all of this is expensive and it costs money, but then there are all these agendas behind that money and the access and whatever it creates. Does anyone want to speak to that?
I could pop in here just to reference someone Amy's already mentioned, which is Martian Alahari, who refers to this as digital colonialism, and speaks to the ways in which these infrastructures were not made for us, whether it's like Zoom that we're on now or like the YouTube and Facebook that it's being shown on, and that there are these replications, so that the 3D modeling that she did, she found that the models that she put on open source online were only really being reprinted by like white males in America, right? Because those are the people who play with these things, and the kind of Iranian access wasn't happening, no? And that's just like, it's the reality of the thing. And I think that one of the challenges of this sort of data politic and this digital colonialism, certainly for me, is feeling quite like out of my depth about the degree to which the ways in which this can be abused. You know, like it's quite a complex space to operate in, particularly as someone who's not a tech like local. That's not my space. But I think that working with some people who have been working within those frameworks, that there's quite interesting ways that people have found to address some of these concerns, and like some of the work around open data is one way to handle that, though it's obviously not the answer, like in this example of Martian. But open data being definitely one of the strategies that people are doing really interesting things. And then I think, as Karen said, that like real intentionality around how you then situate that data in spaces where you want it to have value. Because the infrastructures are massive, and people often speak about, you know, we need to build our own servers, we need to, et cetera, et cetera. But in many ways, that's replicating the same systems which are sort of built and born out of really problematic spaces, and don't necessarily solve the broader scale problems around how that's being used, which are like multinational global problems, right? Like a little artist is not going to fix them. And so I think that point around intentionality and ensuring that the work that we do addresses the main concerns we're aiming for, rather than just like spray and pray, put it out there, it's accessible kind of work, for me is the only possible like way to not feel really crap about it the whole time. Yeah.
Yeah, Karen, did you want to weigh in?
I'm just here to say here, like the question of power can never leave archives. Like, in knowledge production is like the issues of power will always be there. So I don't think anybody has figured out that. Once somebody figures out that part, then maybe we can start playing around with what we're doing with the archive. But as long as there's power issues within knowledge production, we're in trouble, bro.
So, Karen, what you are reminding us in Molemo and Amy is that where there's archive, there's power. Where there's archive, there's power, which generates then the question, so do we still need archives? We probably do. It's probably a human thing. No, I don't know. It's knowledge. It's knowledge production. I was going to speak to your question, Elizabeth, about the Western lenses and this and that, just to add to this question of authority and power and so forth. And what I find in working with the archive is that the Western lenses will always be there. In this process of doing decolonial work and try, the colonial is such a burden. It's always there. You are here thinking, okay, I'm decolonizing. I've got this, you know, I'm using African methods. And then it just comes, and then I'm like, why does it feel like I'm still caught up in the colonial? Because it's somehow, it's there. Power.
Wow. Wow. So as you guys are speaking, and if anyone watching online has any questions, please drop them in the comments and we'll address them in the last 10 minutes. But I'm wondering about care. Like, this sounds like very stressful work. And I mean, we all know the structural and all sorts of issues. How do you take care of yourselves and the work that you're doing and kind of guard space for that?
Okay, let me jump in. So care is complex, right? How do you care for yourself? I mean, you have to have boundaries. You have to have boundaries. That's what I learned, because the archive can be addictive. You have to be able to say, okay, I'm drawing the line here. It's also about being able to go back to that question of intentionality. As a person who's in performance studies, questions of representation are key. It's whether, as a person who comes from a country that has gone through the first 21st genocide, 21st century genocide, and there's archival evidence, which as artists we get invited to look at and work with. It's asking myself whether that's what I want to show. And usually I avoid all of that stuff when I work in these archives and I go to Germany or Switzerland and there's this photographic evidence, right? And rather look elsewhere. Elsewhere that I spoke about, thinking about, for example, bringing the fire into the museum as an intervention, because where I come from, we use fire as care, or fire as a portal, as a repository to other knowledges. So for me, it's about creating your own rituals, but also having boundaries, because I don't want to portray violence and daunt myself with images of violence 24/7. Just no. But care is complex. Care is very complex, especially when you get into questions of curatorial work. Care is tricky because you might think you are making care, but actually you might be doing something else.
For me, I think care is about two things. It's about sensitivity, as Nashi said, sensitivity to the kinds of information and images that you're dealing with, and the kinds of images that you want to continue people to see in the future. And then it's also about attention, paying care, paying attention, like paying attention to paying like deep attention to your sources, and where they're coming from and the kinds of stuff that they're like bound up in. and then paying attention to the way in which you remix or like reproduce or just choose not to like reproduce the stuff in the future. That's kind of what care is for me.
Yeah, I'd really like to pick up on what Amy's saying in terms of not repeating the nonsense that you've seen in the archive, for more people to just proliferate nonsense. And I think that's also something that applies to myself, like having come from like this, I guess, point of like, we are going to fix the historical narrative, right? They told the wrong story, now we're going to tell the right story. And kind of shifting into a place where I'm like, okay, if I'm working with more, I guess, contemporary data sets, contemporary information, what kind of new things can be introduced to narratives? What can assist people to know that knowledge is not as fixed as we think it is, so that when you are reading a book about the Black continent or the Dark continent, you're not taking it in as fact, but rather as something that you can critically engage with. So I think it's yeah, trying not to fix, getting out of that mentality and more so being like, guys, let's play around with the fact that knowledge is actually quite malleable, and it's what's happening in here that actually matters more than what is being put on your plate. So yeah, that for me is where the care happens.
Quick 2 cents. First, just to say, Elizabeth, I think this is such an amazing question. So thank you for asking it, because I think archival work can also be incredibly traumatic and painful work. It's kind of Mushan just pointed to. And so I agree with what everybody has said. And the only thing I would add is a kind of community of practice, and a critical community of practice, who can hold you accountable. Mushan just been this person for me before. And who can also be like a place to kind of process and like unpack and work through a lot of the really painful stuff and the stuff that makes us start to lose our minds as well.
Great. We had a comment from YouTube, and maybe we can touch on this briefly just before we close. How about decoupling from neocolonialism's gaze, definition, and control of archive? Shifting from archive as depository and acquisition to, say, a living archive that's iterative, a kind of lateral giving and sharing of dynamic knowledge. Does anyone have any? I think that's touched on quite a lot of what has come up in conversation, but if anyone wants to respond to that briefly.
Sure.
Mhm.
I'll try. I'm gonna try. I'll say try. Maybe just to also open up to the rest of the panel. But I think, again, the idea of definition, right, is that it allows you to manage what you are dealing with. So I always struggle with this thing of like redefining the archive, but if that redefinition of archive going to impact on the actual definition of archive? That makes sense. Or we're having two separate conversations. So I don't know. I actually don't know if those conversations can happen within. It's like you define something, but then you want it to be undefined. I don't know how to I don't know how you would manage that, but that's my 2 cents.
If I could add, because I come from the tradition of African queer theory, and African queer theory has been very interested in questioning the archive and the usefulness at all for an archive, particularly for not just LGBTIQ people, but queer knowledges in general. And what I find that's interesting with, if I can use this word, defining what archive is, defining archivality from that school of thought of queer theory, is that it offers almost something that cannot always be defined, or it cannot have a conclusive definition, something that is slippery, fluidity. We were speaking now about fixation, and that queer and queer knowledges and this work of queering knowledge allows us to constantly be attentive, pay attention to what Amy is talking about, pay attention to normativity, the normative archive, and to constantly be aware that for as long as there is whatever might be considered a normative archive, and that can be anything from a colonial archive to oral history, the dominant archive, there will always be a counter non-normative elsewhere, somewhere between the cracks. There are always cracks in the normative archive, beyond the normative. So it's maybe always also refusing the fixicity sometimes that definition makes us do, and to always allow the archive to transform, or archives to transform, because in actual fact it's never really just the archive, that there are many archives always speaking to each other. So for me, queering the archive sounds like something I want to remain with, because that's where the trouble is also.
Thanks for that. And I think on that note, we have 2 minutes left. We're going to quickly just wrap up with what are your hopes for this space, for this process of decolonization of archival work on the continent over the next few years? And maybe we can just hear quickly, or if you have anything that you want to leave us with really fast, because we've got less than a minute. Go Malimo.
I can jump in very quickly to say that I think that the thing that has been really inspiring and motivating and energizing for me has been connecting with other projects, which can be very difficult on this continent. It can be difficult to find each other even when we're online. The Francophone African divide, Lusophone divide is massive. But more of that connection I find is just like mind-blowing, and I hope that's the future.
Awesome. Karen, final word.
No, I definitely agree with that. I think more conversations like this. It's like Ushanja, I met in 2018, right? And I'm seeing him again 5 years later, you know, and still working within the same space of archive and museums. We don't have enough of these conversations with each other. Molemo, I've bumped into your work online, but to be like, yo, what up, sis? I'm struggling with this and this project. I think those conversations will help in terms of also just not even same paging, but just figuring out like, guys, what are we doing? And also, can we assist each other in getting to where we want to get to? I think my hope is that we have a better network of people going on in constant conversation with each other around these questions, and not just in the academic space, but as practitioners as well. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Let's go to Nashilongo Shipwe and then Amy, and then we'll close.
I'm just going to sound like an elder because my youth is almost over, and to say that we need to invest in the youth, the African youth, the African youth in the diaspora on the continent. We need to invest. These conversations of museums and restitution are often dominated by the older generation. So the fact that we are bringing in the internet, we need to make the archive attractive, archival work attractive, and that might be really considering the role of cultural work in the archive. So that the youth, we need to, yeah.
Great, awesome. Support the youth.
Yeah, that was pretty much going to be my final thing as well. Like, apart from what Molemo said about connecting with people who are doing such interesting and amazing work and just really cool archival practices, like the most inspiring and something that just gives me like a sigh of relief is like working with young people and on like archival stuff, and seeing young people get really excited about preserving stuff that maybe they never even thought was like important or something worth preserving. So yeah, same.
Great. So we're out of time. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our amazing panelists. It's been a really, really great conversation. Really great to speak to you all and learn more about your process. And thank you to everyone who's watching. Yeah, and that's a wrap.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Think moments and memories. Make magic and movies. Share between sons and daughters, or just friends in their quarter. More music, more movement, more space for amusement, where history was made and the future is paved. Adventure awaits. Together, embraced. Just down the highway. Think Midlands, my way.